Happy December, Earthlings, although you may not be watching this in December. So we've gotten a few requests over the years, people wondering how to winterize a machine, a walk-behind tractor in this case. We have stuff posted on our website on our maintenance and repair page under the About Engine Fuels section, and we kind of walk through it there. But that's all in text, and people don't want to read anymore, they want to watch videos, which is why we're shooting this video. So here's our old beat up 749 VCS demo, a Honda GX390 engine. The engine type or brand doesn't really matter, or well, as long as it's a gas engine, but whether it's a Briggs or a Kohler or Honda or Yamaha, it doesn't really matter. The procedure is always the same when winterizing. The main thing you're worried about winterizing on a machine is the fuel, because fuel has a shelf life, and that shelf life seems to get shorter every year because they keep putting more and more crap additives into the gas, which makes it go bad quicker. So it is conceivable that if you have a poor quality fuel, it can actually go bad in as little as 90 days. It can actually become too stale to burn. Most of it's not that bad if you get a name brand gas and the station is actually carrying the name brand. That is, if you go to a Shell station, you should be getting Shell gas, but you might not. I mean, some of these places buy from like the cut rate truck that drives by, and you never know. But if it's good quality fuel that is actually a name brand that's being sold through a name brand gas station, it should last 6 months. But anyway, you wanna take steps. So first thing is you can get fuel stabilizer. And there's lots of different products on the market. Stabil is the oldest one, available at any auto parts store, any lawn and garden store, nothing you have to buy from us. But there's a lot of different fuel stabilizers that are on the market now. They all basically do the same thing, which is they inhibit the gasoline's ability to cause to coagulate into like a varnishy residue when the gasoline evaporates. Because that varnishy residue will really plug up a fuel system, particularly the carburetor with its little tiny orifices and holes in it. So that's the main thing a fuel stabilizer does, is it keeps the gas from becoming that varnish. It doesn't actually keep the gas from really going stale. That is, you can have stabilized fuel, that is fuel you've put stabilizer in and then stored for 6 months or a year. Well, the gas will go ahead and go stale. That is, after 6 months, it's probably not going to burn worth a darn. So the engine may start really hard or not start at all. But the good thing is, if it's stabilized, you can just drain the fuel out, replace it with fresh fuel, and everything runs because your carburetor didn't get plugged up. The stabilizer kept the fuel from actually gumming up the carburetor. So in that sense, it's a good thing. There's also a whole section on our fuels page on our website about using aviation grade fuel, which is something, it's a more expensive and highly, or much higher quality gasoline that doesn't actually require stabilizer at all. That stuff will last a couple of years. You don't have to worry about it going stale or using stabilizer. Not everybody has access to aviation gas, so you can read the website about that. I'm not going to go into a big diatribe about that now. But the point is, okay, so you want to store your machine for wintertime. Now, if you have snow removal implements that you're using on your tractor, you're going to be using it during the winter, so you don't have to worry about winterizing in that case. But if you're just having like mowing and slow working implements for your tractor and you're not going to be using it for 4 to 6 months, yes, time to winterize. So get some gasoline stabilizer, whatever kind you like. Startron is a really good product. That's an enzyme-based fuel additive that's very good as a stabilizer as well. And supposedly, from what I've heard, the Startron actually can keep the gas from going stale. I have not proven this to myself, but I've heard this from customers, so you can try that. At any rate, mix a can of gas, with the recommended amount of fuel stabilizer. Put that in the machine, and you should probably at this point make sure that the tank is fairly empty before you put this stuff in, because if you have a half a tank of non-stabilized gas and you fill it up with stabilized gas, well, actually you've only got half the recommended amount of stabilizer because it's thinned out. So that's, you should either drain it down or just wait till the tank, until you run the machine until it's empty and you're filling it up again with stabilized fuel. So once you fill the tank with the stabilized fuel to the recommended level, and I will say that the recommended level on one of these modern engines, most of these modern engines have like a little collar that kind of hangs down in there. You should never fill below the bottom of the collar. So they've got this little screen in there. So like the gas should come to the top of the screen, but should not fill up this space here, because you don't want this thing submerged in gas when you put it back up. Regardless, fill that up, then run the machine long enough so that you know the stabilized fuel has flowed from the tank. Somebody else will get that. From the tank into the carburetor. So run it for like 5 or 10 minutes. And what I usually like to do at that point is shut off the fuel shutoff while the engine's running. On a Honda, that would be this control right here. It's got a little on arrow going that way. So you pull it over here, that shuts the fuel off. On the Yamaha engines, on the Kohler engines, on the Briggs engines, the fuel shutoffs look a little different, but there's always a fuel shutoff. So if you shut it off while the engine's running, what will happen then is no more fuel can flow from the tank at that point. The engine will continue running until it burns out the fuel that's in the carburetor. So just let it run until it burns itself out. And when it finally runs out completely, the engine will do some funny stuff. It'll go and do this surging, carrying on nonsense, but then it'll finally die. So at that point, there's a full tank of stabilized fuel. There is no fuel in the carburetor except what little few remnants of, what droplets of fuel might remain in there are stabilized fuel. So they will not, turn into varnish and plug things up. Now, it is possible that if you have a gasoline that has ethanol in it, because a lot of gasoline has ethanol these days, not all, but a decent amount of it on the market has ethanol added to it. Ethanol is a water-based product, and it's kept in solution with the gasoline by different chemicals they put in with it. Point is that if you do what I just described with an ethanol-based fuel, the few droplets of fuel that might remain in the carburetor with some ethanol in there as well, because that ethanol is laced in that gas, could cause some corrosion on internal carburetor parts if it sits over the winter. So if you've got an ethanol-based fuel, you might not want to run it dry. In that case, you would just put the stabilized fuel in the tank, run the engine until the stabilized fuel is in the carburetor, and then just shut the thing off. Don't bother shutting the fuel to burn the carburetor out. Just go ahead and shut it off normally with your engine kill switch or whatever. After you've shut it off, I would go ahead and close the fuel shutoff, because I always like to close the fuel shutoff just as a matter of course, just to keep an engine from flooding while it's in storage. But the point is, you're storing the carburetor then with liquid fuel in it. It's stabilized fuel, but the liquid fuel will not, yes, if there's ethanol mixed with that fuel, there won't be a corrosion issue because there's no air. Basically the fuel, the parts that are in the carburetor is submerged in the gas. The air won't get on those things to cause the corrosion through the ethanol. That is, the ethanol can draw moisture because it is water-based. But if it's submerged, in gasoline, it can't draw moisture. So that's kind of the idea there. But if you're using a non-ethanol fuel, you can go ahead and burn it out, which I think is a little safer bet in terms of keeping the fuel system in good shape. Okay, so that's enough about fuel. The next thing is, a lot of engine manufacturers recommend that for wintertime storage or long-term storage, that you put a few drops of oil down the spark plug hole in the cylinder. And Michaela's going to walk around here. Thank you for filming, Michaela. Here's the spark plug on a Honda engine, or at least the spark plug cap, which we are going to pull off here. Okay. Spark plug is in roughly the same location on most modern engines. Need to put a screw in that. That's coming loose. Okay, so this is a 13/16 spark plug socket and extension here. Some engines have a bumper guard that comes around here that kind of gets in the way, but you can usually get around it with a long enough extension. Anyway, you take this thing out completely. The spark plug has a long screw thread here, so it takes forever to get it out. Okay, there's the spark plug. And what the engine manufacturer says is put a few drops of motor oil down the spark plug hole. So here's a bottle. We recycle our oil bottles. We fill them up out of a drum, so this thing has no label on it. But whatever kind of oil you're running in the engine, like a 10W40 or whatever. And you know, it's tricky to get down into that hole. So you might have to use like a dropper or use a little tube or something. But literally, when they say 4 or 5 drops of oil, they mean 4 or 5 drops of oil. So if you just like squirt a whole mess of it in there, you're gonna foul the engine up, because all that oil in the cylinder is going to, well, it'll foul up the spark plug the next time you start the engine. But you just want a little bit of lubrication in there to kind of lubricate the cylinder and rings, you know, for long-term storage. Now, this isn't even that important if you're in an arid environment. If you're in areas of the country that don't get a lot of, you know, ambient air moisture, I wouldn't even fool with this procedure. Even here in Kentucky, where I live, I don't bother with this procedure. What I do is, now if I was going to store an engine for multiple years, this would probably be a good idea, but just over the winter, this usually isn't necessary. But what I will do is I will, if I know I'm not going to run an engine for a long time, here, I don't need to fart with this now. Oh, when you put the spark plug back in, just make sure that it threads in easily by hand. You know, if you don't want to put the wrench on it or the socket wrench on it first thing and start cranking it, because if the threads are not lined up right and you just crank it in, you're going to strip the threads, and that gets very expensive in a cylinder head. So make sure it threads in easily by hand several turns before you put a ratchet on it. But at any rate, what I will do, let me back up a little bit. So if I was to put the oil down in there, 4 or 5 drops, I put the plug in, and then I would very slowly pull the engine through its rotation. Don't crank it as fast as you would when you're normally trying to start the engine. Just a very slow crank, maybe 1 or 2 revolutions, just to kind of push that oil around in the cylinder and get it distributed around. But if you're not going to do the procedure of actually putting the oil down, and you just want to make sure that, you know, you just want to make a little extra precaution that moisture does not get into the engine and do any damage due to corrosion, what you can do is actually just leave the plug in it, crank the engine slowly until it comes up against the hardest spot. That's compression. When you come up against compression, that major, you know, the biggest resistance in pulling the rope, that's when the valves are closed. And when both valves are closed, both your intake and exhaust valve, moisture can't get in the engine at that point because the valves are closed. If you just let the engine sit in any position, that needs a little attention. Whenever you shut an engine off, it's just kind of random wherever it stops, and one of the valves could be open and it's resting, you know, wherever it comes to a stop. Your intake or exhaust valve could be open. And, you know, if ambient air moisture is moist enough and seeps in just, you know, through that valve, you could get moisture in there, which could rust the valve or the cylinder wall or something like that. But if you just pull that rope until you hit that compression, that hardest spot in the rotation, the valves are closed, nothing can get in. So that's that. There's not really any other winterization that needs to be done on the machine other than that. Now, I, of course, don't recommend storing these machines outside because you have a lot of pivot points on your various things that move on these things on the handlebars. You got all these pivot points here. If you let that out in the rain, it's all going to rust up. Not a good idea to do that. The cables will all get rusty if you store them out in the rain. The thing really needs to be under cover for the winter time, because the winter is typically the moister time of the year. If you don't have a place to store it inside, you can always put a tarp over it. But if you're going to do that, put the machine on a pallet or something like it, and then put the tarp over it and put rocks or bungee ties or whatever to the surface of the pallet so that air can pass under it. Because if you put a tarp over one of these machines and the tarp goes all the way to the ground, then whatever moisture evaporates up out of the ground gets trapped under that tarp, and the thing is just, it's in a moisture bubble at that point, and it's actually almost worse than leaving it outside uncovered. Almost worse, probably not, but still, if you can get it up on a pallet so there can be some air circulation under it, it works much better. As far as like changing the engine oil and changing the transmission oil and all that, you want to do that in the spring after this period of storage is over, because during the period of storage, if you get any major moisture events or whatever, and condensation gets inside your transmission or your engine, you don't want that condensation to go into the brand new oil you just put in there, because you're going to have to change it out in the spring to get rid of the condensation. So it's better to leave the old oil in there for the winter and then just change it out in the spring before you start using the machine. And that's also a good idea in the springtime to get your little squirt bottle of penetrating oil or some kind of Teflon lubricant or something like that, and go over the pivot points of the tractor. We cover a lot of that on the handlebar maintenance videos on the Air Tools website as well. So, and in the spring, you also want to do your air filter maintenance. We have an air filter maintenance video on our website. Some places recommend doing air filter maintenance before you put it into storage, but I say, if a mouse comes and eats on your air filter during the winter, why would you want them to do that on a new air filter? Let them eat on the old one and then put a new one in the spring. So, and when you come back to it in the spring and you're doing your oil changes and filter maintenance and possibly changing the gas if the gas has gone stale over that storage period like I talked about earlier, also air up your tires, because if you've got pneumatic tires on the machine, they will typically lose some pressure over the winter, and you're going to want to pump those back up to 20-25 psi in the spring before you start using the machine. That pretty much covers it. Thanks for watching.